So I am going to just talk a brief little bit about sucrose, and I'm going to really resist the temptation to get in deep with sucrose because I could easily take up the rest of the semester talking about sucrose and fructose and glucose, but I won't do that to you. Anyways, this is just the very basics of how your body even uses sucrose. So sucrose, that molecule craftily spinning in the background there, is a disaccharide that is an alpha 1,2 linkage between glucose and fructose. All right, and so that means the carbon 1 of glucose, the carbon that's the anomeric carbon, it's the carbon that's bound to 2 oxygens. One of those oxygens is the linkage oxygen that you see bridging the 2 rings right there, centered at the moment. And then on the fructose, its anomeric carbon, because it's a ketose, is actually carbon 2. It's not carbon 1. All ketoses, they're called ketoses because that carbon that has the double bond to O is a little bit further into the chain and doesn't have one of its groups being just a plain hydrogen. So sucrose is a really weird molecule, actually, because it has 2 anomeric carbons linked together in the glycosidic bond. And it's ironic, for as weird as that linkage is, that it is as common a molecule as it is. Sucrose is obviously everywhere, particularly nowadays in the modern diet. People eat a lot of sugar. We'll see that in a bit. So what do we do with sucrose when we eat it? Your body actually can't utilize sucrose as it stands. And so to be able to use glucose and use the fructose, which is significantly less useful to the body than glucose, it needs to be hydrolyzed into a monosaccharide and a disaccharide. When I use the word hydrolyze, is everybody cool with that word? So sucrase is the enzyme. In general, when you're seeing a word in biochemistry where the last 3 letters are ASE, it means it's some kind of an enzyme. It's an enzyme that's going to catalyze something. So sucrase is an enzyme that breaks down sucrose. And it's just the same as the model that I showed you for lactase. The sucrose comes in, binds, it gets kind of like bent a little bit by the binding to the protein, and that bending, that stressing of the glycosidic linkage enables that glycosidic water to come in, add across that bond easily, and then breaking it up into the 2 monosaccharides, the glucose and the fructose, that your body can take up. So this would be a good spot right here for a picture of the human body with the whole body and then the liver set aside. I should probably have done this, but the rabbit hole that I would run down with sucrose, I'll just give you a peek into it at the moment without having that slide there. And that is to say that every cell in your body can utilize glucose. Every cell in your body can utilize glucose. Only one cell type in your body can use fructose. Only one cell can take up fructose and utilize it, and that's your hepatocyte, your liver. Your liver is the only organ in the body that can do anything with fructose. This is why sucrose, like high levels of sucrose in the diet, and even worse, high levels of fructose in the diet are so that, fructose and sucrose that has been divorced from the fiber that those sugars naturally occur in, so like in a fruit or something like that. When you take the sugar out of the fiber context that our biology evolved around, it puts in a really heavy burden on the liver, a caloric burden on the liver. Because, for example, in sucrose, that glucose can be used by your muscles to make animal starch, glycogen. That's the way we store energy. Sugar energy is glycogen. And that can go in the muscle cells, and that helps you do whatever you need to do in the day. But the fructose all localizes to the liver, and the liver only needs so much of that, right? It only needs so much sugar stored there. The fructose itself has to be converted to glucose to be able to be stored. And it leads to what's called fatty liver disease. If you have too much sugar in the liver, it gets converted over to fats. And we'll see that when we look, we'll just do an overview of central metabolism so you can see how that works later on. But that's without getting way deeper into a large topic, that's the heart of why fructose is a problem. It's because most of your body can't actually utilize it, and in the levels that we eat it in the normal American diet, it's actually hepatotoxic. It's screwing up your liver, and then that leads to a whole cascade of other issues that can be well summarized by saying metabolic disorder. We call it metabolic disorder. You've probably heard of that, but there's a suite of different symptoms that are part of this syndrome. So obesity, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like all these different things that are very, heart disease, stroke, cancer. These are the constellation of disorders that travel along with, under the umbrella of metabolic disorder. Okay. So this was the beginning of a little story arc that I was going to tell that was going to culminate in with me talking about Richard Nixon and the policy, like agriculture policy in the 70s towards subsidies on corn, and how that impacted the diet and the rise of high fructose corn syrup and obesity or whatever. And I'm probably not going to tell the whole story arc today, but I'll tell the beginning of it here because it is kind of an interesting little bit. So white sugar has actually been around a pretty damn long time. So the first people to have been documented to isolate white sugar or table sugar, sucrose, were ancient Indians who learned how to crystallize it in the Gupta dynasty about 2,400 years ago. And however, the very first reference to it is older than that in a Vedic text that's 4,000 years old, extremely old Vedic text, the Atharva Veda, a text that is part of the canon, the Vedic canon. So this guy that I have in this statue over here is Sushruta, and he was remarkable. He was sort of, a Renaissance, the Indian equivalent of a Renaissance man about, 2,000 years before the Renaissance happened. He was an incredibly scholarly individual who had, for example, he had wrote a text about the eye and did 70 different surgical procedures just on the eye. He was the first person to do cataract surgery almost 2,000 years ago in India. So there was an extremely high level of erudition and understanding about the body and the natural world in ancient India. He described actually 12 different varieties of sugar back almost 2,000 years ago. Kind of interesting. Or 2,500 years ago. All right, we're going to skip way forward to when Europe really began to discover and embrace white sugar. There was this is in the colonial period here, and there, the Dutch East India Trading Company. There was this demand for cheap sugar, and in Europe, And as like the bourgeoisie rose and there was like disposable income, people wanted sweets. They had resource to spend on it, but they needed to get the white sugar. So the desire for sweetness was one of the real underlying drivers of the slave trade. So the colonial powers came in to the Caribbean because the Caribbean was, these tropical islands were a really ideal place for growing sugar cane. And sugar cane was not something that could be grown in Europe, but has anyone ever had sugar cane? Taken the stuff and chewed on it? Yeah, it's pretty beautiful. It's a pretty beautiful grass. And so these colonial powers, you know, colonized the Caribbean chain and grew sugarcane along it. I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit just about the island of St. John's. I don't know if anyone's ever been to St. John, but it's one of the islands in the U.S., Virgin Islands. And it's an interesting place because you can see there in that map, the dark green part of it, 65 or 70% of the island is actually a national park, which makes it quite unique in terms of the islands in that chain along there. And what's interesting and relevant to our story is that because it has been turned into a park, a lot of the remnants of the former sugar processing industry are still very evident. They haven't been destroyed and like walled over with Kmart's, like on St. Thomas, which is the island that you can see just to the west there. St. Thomas is, you know, looks like any city in Florida or something. Okay, so growing sugarcane is actually a pretty labor-intensive, kind of nasty bit of work. It was hot. And working in those mills was pretty gnarly work, and so this is what was really driving the slave trade. This demand for cheap and docile labor was. And so this is, you know, like Domino Sugar, and that, like the sugar cartel out there likes to ignore its roots, but this is really at the root of it all. The sugarcane was put in these presses, and initially they would have human labor turn these presses. You can see it on the left there. There's this human-powered press, and then the juice would, the cane juice would run down these little sluiceways. Here's the sluiceway into these boiling vats here, and they would go. It was sort of a distillation process where they were boiling off water, crystallizing the sugar down until they were getting some kind of like a molasses or a turbinado type sugar. Eventually, because this was, there were actually a lot of Dutch people that were colonizing St. John's. This was a Dutch colony. They brought their expertise for wind, and eventually that was there's a beautiful trade wind that blows across the island, and that replaced the need for human power milling. That era passed, thankfully, and now those sometime if you are ever down there, it's interesting to go and look at these ruins, which are pretty neglected. They're not really like, it's not like set up like a tour or something. A lot of them are just like deep in the jungle that you got to go look at. You can sort of see the echoes of the industry that was there, the slaves that had terraced all the hillsides that are just overgrown with jungles now. But it's quite hauntingly peaceful, given the sort of intense history that happened in that place. So, anyways, by about 1880, fairly late actually, was when sugarcane finally left the island. Okay. So, again, I'm skipping this whole interesting story in the 70s about sugar subsidies and all that. Maybe I'll tell it later. But just to show this picture, how much sugar do we actually eat? So back in 1820, when the Dennis Bay was, beginning to wind down, but still at about not far from its peak production, the average person in the UK ate about 4 pounds of sugar, of white sugar, a year. 4 pounds per year. And nowadays, that number is around 125 to 170 pounds of sugar a year that the average American eats. And that's in total. This is not you just like spooning sugar into your mouth. This is in actually primarily sugary drinks. That's one of the main ways that people consume sugar, but it's in everything. Like when you eat ketchup, it's full of it, or when you eat, all kinds of things have a shocking amount of sugar in it. And it's interesting to look at this diagram, actually. I had been considering doing an activity with you guys in the lab where you actually dissect this this chart. When you look at the chart, you can see these dips. Like there's a dip right here around 1863. There's another dip right here in the 40s. What do you think's going on? Can you can anybody explain for me why they see that? Yeah. Yeah, of course. Here is the Civil War. Here is World War I. Here's World War II. Right. Otherwise, it has been a steady increase in the consumption of sugar. Steady increase. One of the things, I don't know, did I put that image in? No, I didn't. I have one where there's this guy who's taken this thing and he's projected it out to the year, I think it's like the year 2625 or something like that, where the human diet will be nothing but white sugar. Like everything that we eat, like it's the only thing we will eat is white sugar by the year 2625. Obviously, that's absurd. And we are going to have to reach a breaking point at some point. And I imagine, I hope at least, that it's that reckoning that comes over the consumption of sugar in our society comes during your lifetimes. Hopefully during mine, but at least during yours. Okay, because it's not stopping. It's not slowing down even. It's becoming more recognized. But all right, so that's all I'm going to talk about disaccharides. Then we'll move on to polysaccharides here, so we can get out of the sugar chapter and get on to some other things. Let me turn on the alarm here. Yeah, polysaccharides are just chains, long chains of monosaccharide units. And so there are a couple different types of polysaccharides, broad categories. You can have ones that are homopolysaccharides, meaning they're like very repeating units. It's very, like the whole macro structure has very repeating units. And then there are heteropolysaccharides, which we're not even going to remotely talk about because that's the deep end of the pool in terms of sugars. But these are ones where all the sugars in those chains are of a different identity, and those are not energy. They're not especially nutritionally important. Those are more like the UPC codes of the cell. They help the cell sort proteins and whatever. But we're going to talk about these homopolysaccharides. And there's within that, there's a couple different categories. There are these storage polysaccharides, all right? And so amongst storage polysaccharides, they're going to break into two categories, plants and animals, all right? Plants store sugar as starch, what we call starch, and specifically it's called amylose. Now, amylose is a polysaccharide of glucose. It's just glucose after glucose after glucose. And it's alpha-1,4 linked glucose. You can see a picture of a starch granule. So this would be just like the starch that you saw under the microscope for the flour, but at a much higher magnification, right? It has this like crystalline structure, and we see this starch in all kinds of things. This is how plants store energy. When they need to burn energy for growth processes, they're utilizing the energy that's in the starch. So say you have a seed. Seed is going to germinate. It needs that energy before it can really photosynthesize. It's storing that energy as starch in the seed pod or in the potato or what have you. All right. So you can kind of think of it sort of like this, just a long chain of glucose that's 1,4 linked to one another. There are branching patterns on it, however. So here's another type of polysaccharide that's called amylopectin. It's another type of starch, amylopectin. Amylopectin has the same long chains of alpha 1,4 linked sugars, but amylopectin also has some branches on there that are alpha 1,6 linked. All right, so amylose is going to be like a nice chain, and amylopectin is going to be more like a branching structure, where the runs are going to be made out of alpha 1,4, and then the branch points are alpha 1,6. And in amylopectin, that happens every 25 or 30 residues. Amylopectin, this molecule, is one of the things that is in, for example, the skins of apples or grapes, and is what, when you boil those things and make jelly, this is the thing that thickens up the jelly, right? One of the things that thickens up the jelly. So you can buy this kind of a starch and use it if you're making some kind of jelly, or you want to thicken up your apple pie. You can put grate some orange zest that has amylopectin in it, and leave some of the apple skin in there if you want. That'll do it. So this is how that works. Here is some amylopectin in panel A. You see that this is the dehydrated starch. It's super efficient for storage because of that alpha 1,4 linkage. Is actually it allows those sugars to not be bent. It forms a kind of a coil. It's a really compact way to store carbohydrates. They get coiled up and tightly packed. But if you stick it in water and you start boiling the piss out of it, all those sugars. So if you look at the sugar, right, a sugar has all these OH groups sticking off of it that are going to hydrogen bond and interact with water. When you start to boil a starch like this in water, it takes up that water and puffs out like this, right? And then overlaps with one another and highly increases the viscosity of the thing that the solution that you have, right? Viscosity is how easily something flows. So water is pretty low viscosity compared to like honey, which is higher viscosity, or jelly is obviously very high viscosity. Right? And this is how that works. It's just compact when it's dehydrated, and then it gets increased in volume when it gets hydrated. With pectin, and amylopectin, we call this gelatinization. This is what a gelatin is. When they get hydrated like this is what makes them easily digestible. Because when they're dehydrated, like in panel A, that sugar is actually not, the enzymes are going to be able to cleave off the glucose monomers and provide glucose for your body to utilize. They just can't get in there and do what they're supposed to do when it's dehydrated. Okay? And so then you hydrate the starch, puff it up, and the enzymes can get in and cleave it off. This is why, I didn't introduce the concept of glycemic index, but glycemic index is a way of quantifying how rapidly a food is going to spike your blood sugar, right? Something with a higher glycemic index is going to spike your blood sugar faster. Not necessarily good, because a spike in blood sugar means you produce more insulin, you become insulin resistant. It's bad for your pancreas, can lead to diabetes, that kind of thing. So it's good to have low glycemic index foods, and actually starches that are undercooked a little bit, like al dente pasta that hasn't been fully cooked, or it's a little, to the teeth is what al dente means. Just edible, just cooked perfectly, but not overcooked. That has a lower glycemic index than way overcooked pasta, because that starch has been fully hydrated, and your enzymes can get in there and liberate tons of glucose really quickly, and it's going to spike your blood sugar a lot faster than a starch that's been undercooked a little bit. While eating a raw sweet potato may not be your most favorite thing, it's actually, if you slice a little bit of like thin sticks of sweet potato into a salad with other stuff, it can be pretty good, and it's a really good way to have very long, stable blood sugar. It's not bad to eat that kind of thing. It just doesn't taste as yummy to us as a cooked starch, right? And that makes sense. A cooked starch has, a lot of readily available sugar. It's going to taste better to us. Okay, questions on that? So here's how it breaks down a little bit. The starch, the amylose and the amylopectin, there are specific enzymes. I'm not going to go through every enzyme, but one of the big one is amylase. It's a protein that cleaves off a disaccharide. All right, it cleaves off maltose, which we've seen maltose already. It's just a 1,4 disaccharide. That's the thing they use to make beer. Maltose is, come on, computers having a hard day. And then the maltose itself is going to get broken down to glucose. Right? So the amylose and the amylopectin has these disaccharide units liberated first. You have to have a special enzyme to break down the 1,6 linkage as well. All right, so that's vegetables. Animals store their sugar in a completely different way. We store it as glycogen. Glycogen gets stored in primarily two tissues in the body. It's made and stored in muscles and in the liver, right? The stuff that's in your muscles is the energy, the backup energy that your muscles need for motion. And the glycogen that gets stored in the liver is it's primarily responsible for maintaining blood sugar, mostly for your brain. All right. Yeah. So when you're between meals or at night when you're sleeping, the liver is going to take that glycogen and break it down and release glucose so that you have steady blood sugar. Glycogen, the only real difference between starch, vegetable starch, and glycogen is in the branching frequency. Everything else about it is the same. It's really the same. It's the same molecule. It's just glycogen has a little bit higher branching frequency than, and it's a little bit denser because of that than vegetable starch is. All right, so we're going to move on to fiber. Fiber. Anyone ever have their grandma obsess over fiber? Mine did. My God. Grandma wake up and put like 3 teaspoons of wheat germ in some water and just slug that down. All right. So fiber is essentially a type of carbohydrate that's not going to get broken down. It's not going to be readily broken down by the body and assimilated. Your body doesn't have the enzymes to cleave the little disaccharides off of the fiber. All right, there's going to be two types of it. There's going to be soluble and insoluble. Insoluble fiber just doesn't go into solution. A good example of that is wood. Right, that's a type of fiber that doesn't go into solution. And you eat cellulose, right? Anytime you eat some kind of vegetable, particularly like a woody one, there's going to be something maybe in the like stems or something. You're going to get a little bit of insoluble fiber in you. Soluble fiber, as the name suggests, is soluble in water. It dissolves in water. And soluble fiber is pretty interesting. It's easily fermented in the colon. If you eat too much soluble fiber and your gut is not used to it, the gut flora is not used to it, it can lead to bloating and gassiness. You know, farting, that sort of thing, soluble fiber. And it can delay gastric emptying. So that can actually be a good thing. That meaning if you have a lot of soluble fiber in the stomach, the food resides there longer, and you have an extended feeling of fullness, right? So if you have a diet that has a reasonable amount of soluble and insoluble fiber, they can help you with appetite control. The modern American diet is actually sadly lacking in a lot of soluble fiber, which is one of the reasons appetite control is kind of a hard thing for some Americans. So here are just some examples of places you can get soluble and insoluble fiber: barley, oats, beans, sweet potatoes, prunes, figs. Actually, my favorite source of soluble fiber is flax seeds. I put flax seeds over, and you know what? Damn it, I should have brought some to school today. Check that out. But anyways, I've talked about those. And chia seeds you soak them in water. They get that slimy consistency. That's soluble fiber. Sources of insoluble fiber: the grains like cereal, anything that has the whole wheat berry, apple, lentils, avocado, strawberry. These all have great amounts of insoluble fiber in them. And the insoluble fiber, so that's what we would call bulk. It's the bulk. And one of the things about insoluble fiber is they absorb water. They do hydrate. They don't go into solution, but they do absorb a lot of water. And so because of that, they keep, we're going to talk about poop here. It maintains your feces in a hydrated state, which makes it a lot easier to pass, right? You want to have just healthier for your colon for a number of reasons. Okay. Here's some examples of some soluble fiber. So this thing is called psyllium, the psyllium husk, the husk of the psyllium plant. So people with GI issues often will take some psyllium to try to reestablish a healthy motility and flora in their gut. They add psyllium. I don't know. You can add it to your oatmeal or whatever. Or like my grandma, you can just stir it into a glass of water and slug it down. But it's pretty interesting from a structural carbohydrate perspective. It has this really weird xylose alpha-1,3 glucose linkage, which I know is not interesting at all to any of you, but it's an unusual carbohydrate linkage that's in there. The sugar itself, beyond promoting bowel function, actually interacts with the lipids, your blood lipids, and can lower cholesterol, lowers your triglyceride levels, and helps to stabilize your blood glucose levels. So if you're a person who is like prone to wildly fluctuating blood sugar, having some kind of soluble fiber like this in your diet can help stabilize that. I'm just chugging through this. Does anybody need to slow me down, ask me a question, express amazement or wonder? No. What's that? Yeah, no. Okay. Some more soluble fibers. Well, they're the fructans. And the fructans are a large family of polymers that have fructose in them. You get fructans in a whole host of foods. This fructose, remember, this is fiber. So this fructose is not fructose that's free. It's tied up in the structure of the molecule, and your body is not processing it. So I know I'm putting this picture up here. I do not expect you to draw that picture for me. I just want to make that clear, right? So that just so you can see and begin to get a sense of kind of the broader structure of these things. This fructan in particular is called inulin. And inulin is found in those foods I highlighted there: asparagus, garlic, onion. But who knew? It's also in white bread and wheat flour. So you can find inulin in a number of places. Other examples of soluble fiber. So this is related to, but not the same as amylopectin. This is pectin. So pectin is a structural polysaccharide that is particularly highly concentrated in the skins of various fruits. Yeah, it's in the cell wall of a lot of terrestrial plants. And the repeating unit is galacturonic acid. Galactose has an inverted configuration around C4 from glucose. And similar to glucose in every other way, though. And the uronic acid part of it just means that instead of a hydroxyl group, you see that it has this carboxylic acid group sticking off the C6 end of the galactose. So this acid group is easy to ionize so that it's actually a charged group. These pectin polymers can be really highly anionically charged or negatively charged. And because of that, it can give pectin a really unusual characteristic. It can make pectin a little bit slippery, actually. It can be a little bit slippery, but also it can go through the same gelatinization process as the amylopectin. So this is the primary gelling agent that you'll find in jams, jellies, etc. Pectin. Xanthan gum. How much time do we got here? 5 minutes. So xanthan gum is it's a complicated structure. I'm not going to walk you through the structure at all, but it is another one of these soluble fibers that you see in a lot of processed foods and food products. So you've got ice cream, and it's found in toothpaste, and a lot of cosmetics have xanthan gum in it. What does Amanda use? It's not xanthan gum, is it? Oh, gum arabic, yeah. Yeah, gum arabic is kind of related to this. But xanthan is just another sort of thickener, a thickening agent. So like the goo that's inside of a Pop-Tart has got xanthan gum in it. It just sort of improves the consistency of these sort of gelatinous things that people use, like toothpaste and lipstick. All right, 2 more to go. Insoluble fibers, we're going to talk about cellulose just a little bit, and then chitin, and then we'll be done. Cellulose is very simple in structure. Actually, we've already seen this a little bit. It's the beta-1,4 linkage of glucose, and because of that, the specifics of that linkage, the structural specifics, enable the glucose monomers to lay in a very flat chain, just like a straight chain, and they're able to hydrogen bond with adjacent chains. It's like the perfect Lego set. Imagine a world of nothing but yellow Lego blocks that are able to snap in together. Forms a broad sheet, and it's extremely resistant to enzymatic degradation. I remember when I was in graduate school, I met a guy named, what was his name? John Brady was his name. He was a carbohydrate chemist at Cornell at the time, and he had told a story about when he used to work for the government down in Los Alamos, and they were trying to get him to engineer a bacteria that would hydrolyze this stuff into glucose, that would take cellulose and just that would produce the enzyme that would cleave off the glucose and produce that. And then they have glucose, which would be an excellent source to make ethanol out of. That was their goal. They wanted to make ethanol this is when the big push for ethanol and gas was on. What's the problem with that? He didn't succeed. You wouldn't see a problem with that? You think? Yeah. Holy shit. 80% of the planet is made out of this stuff. Like, the whole foundation of life is that. And if we had, obviously there are organisms that break wood fiber down. It does happen. But it is not something, it's not a readily available source of glucose for most of the biome. It could be kind of a dangerous thing. So he kind of came to that realization and decided to not work on that project anymore and moved on. But it was interesting to think about how much of our life is dependent upon a single bond, right? Just the ability of this bond right here to not be easily broken down by organisms is the foundation of life on Earth. I don't think that's hyperbole. All right, so just to drive home this comparison here, because I'm not going to ask you to barf up all of the linkage stuff of all of these sugars, but I want to make some of the very simple comparisons for you guys, and that's the comparison between cellulose, the structure of cellulose, and amylose. They're almost exactly the same thing. Except the configuration around C1 in the glucose is alpha rather than beta. And then we get amylose, which has totally different properties, right? Totally different properties. It forms these gels. When you hydrate it, it's highly compact in this coiled form. It's the source of glucose for organisms. Whereas cellulose is completely resistant to degradation and is not a readily available source of glucose for organisms and acts as a structural protein. A structural saccharide in much of nature. All right, so that's it. The last one is chitin. Chitin is basically glucose with this amide group on here. And it forms the shell in shellfish. Your body's not able to break that up either. But this glucosamine that's in the shells is actually a really excellent source of nutrition, this N-acetylglucosamine. It's good to make fish stock out of the shells of shellfish. Get a little glucosamine in your body. Keep those joints in shape. That cartilage happy. Okay, I'm out of time.